People like you don't belong in rooms like this, Ethan Caldwell said, his voice smooth, practiced, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to silence a room worth over $500 million. And just like that, the laughter came. Low, controlled, expensive laughter, blending into the soft jazz drifting through the private dining suite on the 47th floor overlooking Manhattan, where crystal glasses caught the amber light, and deals were made with handshakes worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. And in the middle of it all stood Naomi Brooks, tray in hand, posture steady, expression unreadable, as if the words had passed through her instead of landing. But they didn't. Not really, because words like that don't disappear. They settle, they stack, they wait. Ethan didn't even glance at her as he leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks, confident in the way only a man used to winning could be. CEO of Caldwell Dynamics, a company that turned risky ideas into billion-dollar empires, a man who believed every room had a hierarchy, and he was always at the top of it. And to him, Naomi was exactly what she looked like, a waitress, background, invisible unless needed, someone who poured water and cleared plates, not someone who listened, not someone who understood. But Naomi listened to everything, every number, every clause, every careless assumption wrapped in confidence. Her movements quiet, deliberate, as she refilled glasses and stepped between conversations that weren't meant for her. Because invisibility has its advantages, it lets you see what others miss. And tonight, there was a lot being missed. The contract lay open on the table, pages thick, heavy with legal language and promises measured in millions, the kind of document that decided futures, and Ethan tapped it lightly with his pen, smiling at the investors across from him. Once we sign this, it's done, he said, easy, certain, like gravity, like inevitability, and heads nodded, because men like Ethan didn't get questioned, they got followed. Naomi paused just for a second, barely noticeable, her eyes flicking to a single line buried deep in the document. A detail so small it hid in plain sight, the kind of mistake that doesn't look like a mistake until it's too late. And for a moment she said nothing, because people like her weren't supposed to interrupt, weren't supposed to speak. Unless spoken to, weren't supposed to step into spaces that made it clear they didn't belong. And yet something in her didn't sit right. Not the numbers, not the wording, not the quiet confidence that filled the room like no one had anything to lose. Ethan picked up his pen again. The final motion before everything became permanent, before signatures turned into consequences. And that's when Naomi felt it. That shift, that line you either stay behind or cross. And her fingers tightened slightly around the tray as the room leaned forward, waiting for the deal to close, waiting for the billionaire to do what billionaires do. And in that exact moment, just before ink touched paper, Naomi took a step forward into a space she was never meant to occupy, her voice calm, steady, almost too soft for a room like this, and she said one word that didn't belong, but somehow stopped everything. Wait. The word did not echo, but it landed, heavy, cutting clean through the polished air like something real in a room full of rehearsed confidence. And for a fraction of a second no one moved. Not the investors, not the assistants. Not even the pianist in the corner whose fingers hovered just above the keys, as if the music itself had paused to listen. And Ethan Caldwell slowly lifted his eyes, not annoyed yet, just curious in the way powerful men are when something unexpected dares to interrupt their timing. And for the first time that night he actually looked at her, really looked, not at the uniform or the tray, but at the fact that she had spoken at all. And there was a flicker there, brief but sharp, the kind that asks a silent question without ever saying it out loud. Who do you think you are? Naomi did not step back, did not apologize, did not rush to fill the silence she had created, because she understood something most people in that room did not. Silence is only uncomfortable for those who are unsure, and she was not unsure. She set the tray down carefully on the edge of the table, her movements controlled, respectful but not submissive, and the smallest shift in posture made the moment feel different, like the scene had changed without anyone announcing it. One of the investors let out a soft chuckle, the kind people used to reset tension. Is there a problem? He asked, not to her but about her, as if she were a disruption to be managed rather than a person with a voice. And Ethan leaned back slightly, pen still in hand, the corner of his mouth tightening into something that was almost a smile, but not quite. "If this is about service, you can speak to the manager after we are done," he said, calm, dismissive, already closing the door on whatever she might say, because in his world people like her did not bring information, they brought interruptions. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unshaken, and when she spoke again her voice did not rise, did not demand attention. It simply held it. "It is not about service," she said, and now the room leaned in. Not because they respected her, but because curiosity had replaced comfort. "It is about the contract." And that was enough to shift everything. Because contracts were sacred in rooms like this. Contracts were power written in ink. Contracts were the difference between winning and losing. And suddenly the idea that a waitress was referencing it at all felt like a mistake that needed to correct itself. Ethan's expression hardened slightly. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, controlled. "You are out of line," he said, each word measured, precise, the kind of warning that usually ended situations before they began, and for most people it would have, but Naomi did not move. Because she was not reacting to his authority, she was responding to something else entirely, something written in black and white just inches from his hand. "Section 14, she said quietly, and now even the investor who had laughed stopped breathing for a moment. "Because specifics have weight, specifics make things real. The contingency clause on page 32, she continued, and without asking permission she reached forward, not touching the pen, not touching him, just turning the page slightly, so the line sat directly in front of him, and for the first time that night Ethan did not speak immediately. His eyes dropped to the document, scanning, fast at first, then slower, and something subtle shifted in his face, not visible to everyone, but enough, just enough, because confidence moves quickly but doubt takes its time, and Naomi did not say anything else. She did not need to. She had already done the one thing no one in that room expected her to do. She made the most powerful man at the table stop and read. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle at first, like a current beneath still water, as Ethan Caldwell's eyes traced the line Naomi had pointed to, once, then again, slower this time, his fingers tightening slightly around the pen that had moments ago carried certainty, and the silence that followed was no longer polite. It was heavy, observant, the kind that waits for something to break. And across the table one of the investors leaned forward just enough to see the page, his confidence thinning as he followed the clause word by word, lips pressing together as understanding caught up with assumption, because what had looked like standard language now read differently when examined without arrogance. Ethan exhaled quietly, not defeated, not yet, but recalibrating, and he straightened in his chair, the authority still there but no longer effortless. "Explain," he said. The single word directed at Naomi now, not as dismissal but as a test, because men like him did not accept correction. They challenged it, they demanded proof, and for the first time that night the power in the room did not come from his title, it came from the answer he was about to hear. Naomi did not rush, did not overstep, she simply pointed again, precise, controlled. "The language in that clause transfers majority ownership if the performance benchmarks are not met within 90 days, she said, her tone even, her words clear. "But the benchmarks listed on page 28 are tied to external variables your company does not control." And now the second investor shifted in his seat, the weight of the implication settling in, because that was not a minor oversight. That was exposure, the kind that turned a partnership into a risk, a signature into a surrender. Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he flipped back a few pages. Faster now, connecting pieces that should have been obvious. Pieces his legal team had reviewed, pieces he had trusted without question, and the realization did not arrive all at once. It unfolded, deliberate, undeniable, the way truth does when it has been sitting in front of you the entire time. "That is not possible," one of the men across the table said, but his voice lacked conviction, because he was already checking, already seeing it for himself, already understanding that the room they thought they controlled had just shifted in ways none of them anticipated, and Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, just creating space for them to see what she had already seen, because she did not need to argue. The document was doing that for her. Ethan placed the pen down slowly, the small sound of it touching the table louder than it should have been, and for a moment he said nothing. just looked at the contract, then at Naomi, then back at the contract again, as if trying to reconcile the two. The billionaire who believed he had mastered every room, and the waitress who had just exposed the one detail he had missed, and in that pause the hierarchy cracked, not shattered, not dramatically, but enough for everyone to feel it, enough for the illusion of control to loosen. "How did you catch that?" he asked finally, and this time there was no edge, no dismissal, just something unfamiliar, something closer to respect than he would ever admit. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, grounded, as if the answer had always been simple, as if the room had always been wrong about her. And in that moment it became clear to everyone watching that the most important voice in the room was never the loudest. It was the one that saw what others refused to see. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that was the answer before any words came. Because in a room built on speed and certainty, she chose stillness, and that stillness carried weight, the kind that made people reconsider what they thought they knew. And Ethan Caldwell watched her closely now, not as background, not as interruption, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And for a man who built his empire on control, that realization was not comfortable. It was unfamiliar, like stepping into a space where the rules had quietly changed. Naomi finally spoke, her voice steady, unforced. "Because I read it," she said, simple, almost disarming. But there was something underneath it, something that did not need to be explained to be understood, because reading was not just about words on a page. It was about attention, about care, about not assuming that power made you immune to mistakes. And across the table one of the investors let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. More like the sound someone makes when they realize they almost missed something important. Ethan leaned back slightly, his eyes still on her, measuring, recalculating, and for the first time that night, he was not the one setting the pace. He was catching up to it. "You read legal contracts for fun?" he asked. The edge of skepticism still there, but softened by something else, something closer to curiosity. And Naomi shook her head gently. "No," she said. "But I read things people assume I will not understand." And that line did more than answer his question. It reframed the entire room. Because suddenly the issue was not her place in it. It was their assumption about it. A subtle shift moved through the space again. Chairs adjusting, glances exchanged. The quiet recognition that something had changed and could not be undone. And Ethan reached for the contract once more. This time not to sign it, but to study it. His fingers turning the pages with more care, more attention than before, and the authority he carried was still there, but it was no longer absolute. It had been interrupted, challenged, not by force but by clarity. "If what you are saying is correct," he began, choosing his words carefully now, "this clause exposes us to full acquisition risk under conditions we do not control." And Naomi gave a small nod, not triumphant, not proud, just confirming what was already written. And one of the men across the table sat back slowly, his earlier confidence replaced with calculation, because deals like this did not just collapse. They shifted, they rebalanced, and sometimes they disappeared entirely. The pianist in the corner resumed playing, softly, cautiously, as if unsure whether the moment had truly passed, and the music felt different now, less like background and more like a reminder that time was still moving, even if the room was not. And Ethan placed both hands on the table, looking down at the contract, then back at Naomi, and there was something new in his expression, something he did not often show, not in boardrooms, not in negotiations, not in front of people who expected him to lead without hesitation. And it was not doubt, not exactly. It was awareness, the kind that comes when you realize control is not the same as understanding. "What else did we miss?" he asked quietly. And that question did more than acknowledge her. It shifted the power entirely, because now he was not correcting her. He was asking for her insight. And Naomi did not step forward this time. She did not take the spotlight. She simply met his gaze and said, "That depends on whether you are ready to actually see it." And in that moment, the room understood something no contract could define, that power does not belong to the one who speaks the loudest. It belongs to the one who sees the truth before anyone else does. The question did not rush her, and she did not rush it back, because moments like this were not about speed, they were about precision, and Naomi understood that every word now carried weight far beyond her position in the room. and she glanced once more at the contract, not to prove anything but to confirm what she already knew. Then she spoke, calm, grounded. "Page 18, she said, and Ethan followed instantly. No hesitation this time, flipping through the document with a focus that replaced his earlier confidence. "The revenue projections are based on a fixed supply chain assumption," she continued, her finger hovering just above the line without touching it. "But the appendix on page 46 shows variable supplier dependency, which means your projections are overstated by at least 12% if there is any disruption." And now the silence deepened again. Not stunned this time, but analytical, the kind of silence that builds when people realize they are no longer in control of the narrative. And one of the investors leaned forward sharply, pulling the appendix toward him, scanning quickly, then slower, his expression tightening as the numbers aligned with what she was saying. Because numbers do not lie, they just wait to be read correctly. Ethan's jaw set slightly, not in frustration but in concentration, his mind moving through scenarios, recalculating outcomes. Because 12% was not a small margin in a deal of this size. It was leverage. It was risk. It was the difference between dominance and vulnerability. And he looked up at Naomi again, this time without any trace of dismissal, only focus. "You are saying the projections are inflated," he said, not as a challenge, but as confirmation, and Naomi gave a small nod. "I am saying they are optimistic under perfect conditions," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Conditions that are not guaranteed." And that distinction mattered, because it did not accuse, it revealed, it did not attack, it clarified. And in a room built on perception, clarity was more disruptive than confrontation. Across the table, the investors exchanged glances that no longer carried confidence but caution, because deals like this were not just about potential. They were about exposure, and what had started as a straightforward acquisition now looked like something far more complex, far more uncertain, and Ethan leaned back slowly, the leather chair creaking softly beneath him, his fingers steepled together as he processed everything in front of him. And for the first time that night, he was not leading the room, he was thinking within it, adjusting to a reality that had shifted without warning. The music in the background faded, again into near silence. As if even the pianist sensed that this was no longer just a dinner. This was a moment, the kind that changes outcomes, the kind that rewrites expectations. And Naomi remained where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present, because she did not need to claim the space. She had already changed it. Ethan exhaled slowly, then reached for the contract once more, not to sign it, not yet, but to close it, the soft thud of the pages coming together, echoing louder than it should have, and he placed his hand flat against it for a moment, as if grounding himself in the decision he had almost made. And when he looked up again, his voice carried something new, something that had not been there before. "This deal is not ready," he said. And just like that, the entire trajectory of the night shifted, because the man who had entered the room expecting control was now choosing caution. And the reason for that shift stood quietly beside the table, not in a suit, not with a title, but with something far more dangerous, the ability to see what others refused to question. The words settled into the room with a finality that no one had expected, not from him, not tonight. And for a moment no one spoke, because no one quite knew how to respond to a man like Ethan Caldwell choosing to stop instead of push forward. And that was the real shift, not the contract, not the numbers, but the decision, because men at his level were known for forcing outcomes, not pausing them. And yet here he was, hand still resting on the closed document, as if he understood that signing it would have been easier than admitting it was flawed. One of the investors cleared his throat, attempting to recover the rhythm that had been broken. "We can revise the terms," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed could restore control. "These are minor adjustments." But the confidence behind his words no longer held the same weight, because what had been exposed was not just a clause or a projection. It was a blind spot, and blind spots do not disappear with edits. They linger, they raise questions, they shift leverage. Ethan did not look at him right away, his gaze still fixed on the table. Then slowly he lifted his eyes, not sharp, not aggressive, but deliberate. "If we missed this," he said calmly, "we missed more." And that statement landed deeper than anything else that had been said that night, because it was not about the deal anymore. It was about trust, and trust, once questioned, changes everything. Across the table, the investors exchanged another glance, this time less subtle, more calculated, because they understood what he was implying, that the document in front of them was no longer solid ground, and no amount of confidence could rebuild that in a single conversation. Naomi remained still, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence no longer invisible but not intrusive either, because she had no need to take ownership of the moment. She had already shaped it, and that was enough. Ethan turned his attention back to her, and there was something different in the way he looked now. Not curiosity, not even respect fully formed, but recognition. The kind that acknowledges value where it was once dismissed. You said there might be more, he continued, his tone quieter, more measured. What else should I be looking at? And this time there was no hesitation in the room, no laughter, no dismissal, only attention, because everyone understood that the dynamic had shifted completely. The billionaire was no longer the only authority at the table. Naomi took a small breath, not to steady herself, but to choose her words, because what she said next would not just affect the deal, it would define how this moment ended. Look at the assumptions, she said, her voice calm. Even, not just the numbers, but what the numbers depend on. And she gestured lightly toward the closed contract, not opening it, not taking control, just indicating where the real issue lived. Every projection, every clause, every guarantee is built on something, she continued. And when those foundations are wrong, everything built on them looks stronger than it actually is. And that was the kind of statement that did not need volume to carry impact. It settled into the room like truth often does, quietly but completely. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it. And for the first time that night, he did not respond with authority. He responded with understanding. And that was the moment the room truly changed. Because power had shifted from assumption to awareness, from control to clarity, and the person who had made that shift possible was not the one with the title, not the one with the money, but the one who had been overlooked from the very beginning, and now could no longer be ignored. No one returned to their drinks, no one checked their phones, because something far more valuable than money was unfolding in that room. Something rare, the moment when certainty is replaced by awareness, and Ethan Caldwell sat there with a contract he no longer trusted and a room that no longer followed him blindly. And for a man who had built his reputation on always being 10 steps ahead, this was unfamiliar territory, not dangerous, but humbling in a way he could not ignore. He leaned forward again, slower this time, opening the contract not with authority but with intention, turning pages with care as if each one now held a question instead of an answer, and the investors watched closely, no longer confident partners but cautious observers, because they understood what had changed. The deal was no longer his to command. It was something to be re-examined, rethought, and possibly redefined entirely. Naomi stood quietly beside the table, her presence steady, not elevated, not diminished, just real, and that was what made it powerful, because she had not demanded recognition. She had revealed truth, and truth does not need permission to exist. Ethan paused again, his eyes scanning another section. Then he stopped, just for a second, and looked up at her. You have done this before, he said, not as a question but as a realization, and Naomi held his gaze, not defensive, not proud, just honest. I have read enough to know when something does not add up, she replied, and there was no performance in her words, no attempt to impress, just clarity, the kind that comes from paying attention when others choose not to. One of the investors shifted in his seat, his voice quieter now. We can restructure the benchmarks, adjust the clause, he offered, but even he knew it was not that simple anymore, because once a foundation is questioned, everything built on it becomes uncertain, and Ethan did not respond immediately. He simply closed the contract again, this time with purpose, not hesitation, and placed it firmly on the table, signaling something final, without saying it out loud. We are not signing tonight, he said, his voice calm but decisive, and that sentence carried more weight than any agreement could have, because it meant control had shifted from momentum to judgment, from assumption to understanding, and no one in the room argued, because they could not after what had just been revealed. The pianist in the corner adjusted his tempo slightly, the music returning but softer, more reflective, as if even the background understood that this was no longer a performance of power. It was a moment of recalibration. Ethan turned to Naomi once more, and there was something different now, something that had not been there before. Not curiosity, not just recognition, but respect forming quietly beneath the surface. "What is your name?" he asked, and it was a simple question, but in a room like this, it meant everything, because it acknowledged her not as a role, not as a function, but as a person. Naomi answered without hesitation, "Naomi Brooks." And the way she said it carried no weight of the moment, no need to prove anything. It was simply her name, something she had always had even when no one thought to ask for it. Ethan nodded once, slowly, repeating it under his breath as if committing it to memory. And in that moment the room understood something deeper than the deal they had come to discuss. That power is not defined by who speaks first or loudest, but by who sees clearly when everyone else chooses not to. And the person they had overlooked from the beginning had just changed everything without raising her voice at all. The room did not return to what it had been, and that was the quiet truth no one said out loud. Because once something is seen, it cannot be unseen, and the shift that Naomi Brooks created lingered in every glance, every pause, every unspoken recalculation happening behind polished expressions and tailored suits. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his fingers resting lightly on the closed contract, not out of hesitation now, but out of reflection, because for the first time in a long time he was not thinking about winning. He was thinking about how close he had come to losing without even realizing it. And that kind of realization does not pass quickly. It settles, it stays, it rewrites how you see everything that follows. Across the table the investors began to gather their things, slower than before, their movements less certain, conversations quieter, because the momentum they had relied on was gone, replaced by caution, and one of them gave Ethan a nod that carried more respect than agreement. The kind of nod that acknowledges a decision was necessary even if it was not convenient. And Ethan returned it without words, because there was nothing left to negotiate tonight. Naomi reached for her tray again. The same simple motion she had made dozens of times before, but now it felt different, not because she had changed roles, but because the room had changed around her. And as she lifted it, one of the assistants who had barely noticed her earlier stepped aside instinctively, creating space without thinking. A small gesture that revealed everything, because respect often shows itself in the smallest adjustments. Ethan stood then, straightening his jacket, the familiar image of control returning on the surface, but underneath it there was something else, something quieter, more aware, and he walked around the table not toward the investors but toward Naomi, each step measured, not dramatic, not rushed, just intentional. And when he stopped in front of her there was no audience reaction, no shift in lighting, just a simple moment that carried more weight than any signature could have. "Naomi," he said, using her name again, and there was a difference now, a clarity in the way he spoke it, as if he understood that names matter, that recognition is not something you assume, it is something you choose. And she met his gaze, steady as before, unchanged by the shift in tone, because she had not done this for recognition, she had done it because it was right. Ethan paused briefly, then continued. "You saw what none of us did." And the honesty in that sentence was not performative, it was precise, the kind that comes when someone acknowledges a truth they cannot ignore. And Naomi gave a small nod, not accepting praise, not rejecting it, simply acknowledging the statement for what it was, and that balance, that restraint, made the moment even more grounded. The city lights beyond the glass windows flickered in the distance, cars moving like quiet signals far below, reminding everyone that the world outside continued regardless of what happened in this room. But inside, something had shifted in a way that would not easily reset, because this was not just about a contract or a deal, it was about perspective, about who gets heard and who gets overlooked, and what happens when that order is challenged. Ethan took a small step back, not creating distance but giving space. And for a brief second he looked at the table, at the contract, at the room that had once felt entirely his, and then back at Naomi, and there was no need for another statement, no need for closure, because some moments do not end with words, they end with understanding. And as Naomi turned to continue her work, moving through the room with the same quiet precision she had always had, it became clear that nothing about her had changed, only the way the world around her now chose to see her had. The night did not end with applause or celebration. It ended with something quieter, something far more lasting, a shift that followed people long after they left the room. And as the private dining suite slowly emptied, the echo of what had happened remained in the space between conversations. In the careful way voices lowered and assumptions no longer felt as solid as they once had, Ethan Caldwell stood by the window for a moment, looking out over the city lights stretching across Manhattan, each one a reminder of the scale of the world he operated in, a world built on speed, confidence, and decisions made without hesitation. But tonight had introduced something different, something he could not ignore, the realization that certainty without awareness is not strength, it is risk. And for a man who had built everything on being right, that distinction mattered more than any number written in a contract. He turned slightly, his gaze following Naomi Brooks as she moved through the room, not as the center of attention, not as someone claiming a victory, but as someone returning to the work she had always done, steady, composed, unchanged. And that was the part that stayed with him, because she had not needed recognition to speak, she had not needed permission to see, and she had not raised her voice to be heard. She had simply understood what others chose to overlook. Across the room, a few of the investors lingered, speaking in quieter tones now, their earlier confidence replaced with something more measured, more thoughtful, because what had happened was not just a disruption, it was a reminder that power does not guarantee clarity, and position does not replace attention, and those who assume they understand everything are often the ones who miss the most. Naomi set down her tray near the service station, adjusting it with the same precision she had shown all night. And one of the staff members glanced at her with a look that held a different kind of acknowledgement, subtle but real, the kind that does not need words to be understood, because respect, when it is genuine, rarely announces itself. It simply appears in the way people choose to see you. Ethan walked toward the exit slowly, not in a rush, not avoiding the moment, but carrying it with him. And as he reached the doorway he paused, just briefly, his hand resting on the frame, and he looked back one last time, not at the table, not at the contract, but at Naomi. And there was no need to say anything else, no need to turn the moment into something larger than it already was, because some lessons do not require explanation, they require recognition. Naomi did not look up immediately. She continued her work, the quiet rhythm of movement and focus that had always defined her. And when she finally did glance toward the room, it was not to check who was watching, but simply to see what remained. And what remained was not power in the way it had been before, not loud, not unquestioned, but something quieter, something more grounded. The understanding that value is not assigned by titles or appearances, it reveals itself when someone is willing to see beyond them. And as the last of the lights dimmed slightly and the city continued its endless motion outside, one truth settled into the silence that followed. That night was never about a deal. It was about perception, about who gets overlooked and who gets heard. And in a room built on power, the only person who truly understood it was the one they almost never noticed at all.